we've been discussing for a period of time the first tenet of Jewish belief, that God is the creator, God guides creation, God did, God does, God will do. And as we said, there's nothing in existence which happens without God's direct involvement. He wills it to be, and it manifests itself exactly as he wills it to be. There's nothing superfluous in existence. There's nothing random. Everything is divine dictate and divine design. And with the objective, ultimately, that the world, through the human being, should reach a level of perfection. And perfection is determined by what God considers perfect, which is within the spiritual realm, which manifests itself in the physical. We said God is the creator. God guides creation. God is whatever he is. And the question is, how do we know this? And this is very fundamental. This really precedes everything. So if you just look at life as it is, events, the word contradiction and is an understatement of what we see. It seems one moment one way, and we have irrefutable proof that it's the other way. I'll give you an example. If you had tzaddik v'tovlo, a tzaddik, devoutly righteous person, follows God's word, and he only has positive experiences in life. He has material to make his life easier. He has health, clarity, success. And you have a person who's no less tzaddik than the first person. All he has is suffering, deprivation, discrimination, and everything which is the antithesis in the physical sense of the other person. I mean, if doing the right thing logically would indicate that things are supposed to be better. And the Torah speaks about reward and punishment. I mean, is the man being punished for doing the right thing? Here, one person, seemingly, if you only look at that frame, being the devoutly righteous person generates blessing. Blessing is something positive. And yet you find another person, you look at another frame, no less righteous, devout, and all the good that he does, all he gets is everything which is contrary to what good is in terms of the value of what he's doing. There's God's reward, there's reward and punishment. Is that reward? Seemingly it's punishment. He's being punished or deprived for being that special person. No rhyme or reason. Rasha v'tovlo, the evil lives high in the hog. So tell me, because God is paying him off, you come up with some kind of reason, rationale, because no person is totally bad, so he's being compensated in this world, so when he leaves this existence, he goes into oblivion. But if you find another person who may be even more evil than that other person, he doesn't have a good day in his life. So is it A or is it B? Or is it neither? Is it, we don't understand. We're so confounded, so confused. And a person who's seemingly intelligent buys into this. You say, you know something? I'm really disappointed in you. I thought you were an intelligent man. I see, well, you're overwhelmed and you live a life of superstition and all this kind of whatever word that person may use. It doesn't make sense. To me, if you read the script, there is no God, God forbid. There is no supervisor. There's nobody guiding this, and it goes in every direction simultaneously. At best, maybe you would say that they're deities, which is the basis for paganism, and the deities, they spar and they're fighting for turf. And one deity actually reigns in on a person because he's not fully committed to that deity. and the other person who has it better, you come up with every concocted approach and rationale why things are the way they are. But bottom line, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense. So how do we Jews understand that everything is meticulously evaluated and God creates, guides, does, and will do? How do we understand this? God is an enigma. Chas v'sholom. I told over the story. I was traveling with this person, and when I speak about God, I say, God is all merciful. So the person looks at me, must have been 40 years old. He said, merciful. He said, do you realize my parents' families were annihilated during the Holocaust? And because of that, the only holiday we keep is the Seder. And we don't keep the holiday, we celebrate the Seder, because that's the only time the family gets together at the Seder. And it's cultural. How could you refer to God as merciful after what happened during the Holocaust? So I said to him, do you believe God is the creator? Yes. God created existence. The American people, the story goes back 35 years ago. The American people, 35 years ago, or 37 years ago, this conversation was, do you believe they're ethical and moral? He says, yes. Are they giving and kind? Yes. Do they take responsibilities for others who they're not even really responsible for? Yes. They're good people. Yes. Kind, giving. So I said to him, it seems to be incongruous. Here, this creator is cruel, heartless, beyond anyone's imagination. And he creates the special people known as the American people who are giving and kind, acts involved in acts of benevolence and loving kindness. Does that make any sense? Seemingly, these people that he creates should be monsters, heartless, cruel. What's going on? He says, you know, you got a good question there. I never thought about that. I never thought of that. The answer is, as much as you think it's one thing, it's not that. But seemingly, but the question is a good question. What about the Holocaust? What about tragedies? People suffer tragedies which are unheard of tragedies in their lives. And people who have nothing in a moment, their lives change for the better, where all the past is forgotten, all they see is the present, the good, the success. What's it all about? How do we know this? How do we know where to begin, where to end? How do you read the script? So we always have to go back to the birth of the Jewish people. Where did the birth of the Jewish people take place? On a small mountain in the desert. It's called Mount Sinai. That's where it began. At Sinai, God opened, there was open communication between God and every single Jew. Open prophecy. And the people who were there, about 4 million Jews at the time, the Jews had left Egypt. God, they themselves attested this fact, that a God opened heaven and earth and showed them nobody exists outside of himself. That means anything that takes place in existence is only due to him willing it to be. Because nothing else takes place, nothing else exists outside of him as the all-powerful, the omnipotent one. Angels, all the other powers, only manifestations of his willing, their ability to function as he wants them exactly to function. That's the reality of existence. How do we know we have a soul? Maybe a human being is an intellectual animal. The chimpanzee. He's more advanced than other species. Maybe we're a super chimpanzee. We have 100 IQ. Chimpanzee only has 40 IQ because he hasn't evolved to the higher level, which is the human being. Evolution. Chimpanzee, human being. Human being, Einstein. Eventually, we evolve beyond Einstein. That's all part of evolution. How do we know? The answer, same answer. When we stood at Sinai, understanding who God is. No power exists outside of him. Understanding that he's the creator. We understand the reason why we are who we are is because God created a human being, which is a composite of the physical and the spiritual. So at Sinai, we came to the realization, the first of the 10 commandments is, I am your God, your Lord, who took you out of Egypt. At Sinai, where God openly communicated with us, and we had that advanced level of prophecy, everything assumed a level of absolute clarity. There were no questions any longer. All the seemingly contradictions were reconciled. I took you out of Egypt. Those revealed miracles. God is the omnipotent one. At Sinai, every answer was reckoned with. We're a composite. We have a soul. We're not an intellectual animal. So the fundamental of everything goes back to that moment where 4 million people were openly communicated to by God. That's what it all goes back to. And he gave us the 10 commandments. And we received the Torah. The Torah is the word of God, of the being who's the omnipotent one, who nothing exists outside of him. We don't understand. You can't understand. As a person with an average IQ cannot understand Einstein's theory of relativity, and Einstein cannot understand King Solomon's wisdom, which bordered on the infinite. So how do you expect we, ordinary people of ordinary intellect, average intellect, how could you understand the infinite divine wisdom? It's impossible. So if we understand that God is the omnipotent being, he's the only creator, he's the only power, and this goes back to Sinai. Once that's fact, there are no questions any longer. And we understood then he is the absolute in goodness, and his interest is only to do good, because good does goodness. But we have questions. How could these be good? Seemingly it's not good. Not simple, as we explained. If a person has a gangrenous limb and you have to take the limb off, is that a good act or a bad action? You're making the person into a person who's an invalid. You took his leg off because it's gangrenous, but a person doesn't understand what gangrene is. So although you took his leg off and now he's an invalid, but you realize you've given him his life. Because if this would have continued for a short period of time, he would have died. So what's goodness, what's not goodness? Is it based on the superficiality of man's grasp of reality? Definitely not. You go to, and this I mentioned many times, God created the human being with a heart, with lungs, with 2 little kidneys. The kidneys filter the blood. The liver takes the toxins out of the blood. The heart pumps the oxygenated blood throughout the body, that the limbs are actually fully nourished, where they thrive and they don't deteriorate. The brain has sufficient oxygen to be able to function. The blood doesn't clot to a degree where it breaks off, and God forbid, a person has a blood clot to bring about a stroke naturally. What happens if the body malfunctions? You go up to 168th Street, You see, Colombian Presbyterian, blocks of hospitals, 14, 16 stories, with billions and billions of dollars of medical equipment, heart lung machines, dialysis machines, everything under the sun to address the body that malfunctions. But God created this little body with two little kidneys, with a heart and healthy lungs. And for that, to replace that, look what you need. If science would have come upon the understanding of how to replicate or to create something which will provide what the kidneys provide, you understand, a good part of humanity would not survive. Modern medicine, antibiotics, antiviral, the majority of humanity would not be here. So that you're able to come upon all these innovations, whether it's equipment, drugs, or food, or whatever it may be, to address the human being to be functional and even be effective. How does this come about? Well, if you believe in nothing and you don't believe God is involved in this equation, the answer is, truthfully, you don't know. I don't know. And whatever theory you may come up with, it can't be correct because the question is such a big question, it's beyond anybody's comprehension, even to grasp, to fathom what that is. I mean, could you do calculations that a computer could do? On one chip, you could have millions of pieces of information in your brain, the human brain. Could you have that much information? Not possible. But you could on that little chip. So if you can't compete with the computer, you want to understand what God is. When God endowed the human being to create this hardware and software to supersede and be beyond any human being's mind. A number of years ago, the Russians, they pride themselves that they're expert chess players. And they had different people with the chess champions of the world, all Russians. And there was a person, I think his name was Karpov. He played chess against the computer in terms of the moves. The computer could think about 30 moves ahead. I'm not sure if he beat the computer. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. It doesn't make a difference. But the average human being, and that's in chess, in other areas, he couldn't beat the computer. So if you don't understand the computer, and you can't compete with the computer, and you can't compete with Einstein, you expect to compete with God. That you want to understand, and if it doesn't meet your standard of understanding, you reject it. You know, as I give the example, Warren Buffett, he comes and he gives a webinar in finance, how to invest. And a person who has basically elementary school education says, rubbish, nonsense, foolishness. You understand? Warren Buffett is giving a seminar, a webinar on financial investment to minimize risk and where to put it. And this person who barely could sign his name says rubbish, nonsense. And people understand what the capacity of Buffett is. They still look at this person. They didn't pay attention to him. It's so absurd and nonsensical, you can't even pay attention to the man. It's like he's born without brains. So to say, if I don't understand that, I can't accept it. Who do you think you are? You can't even get into Harvard and to MIT. But if you don't understand it, you reject it. Is that a rational position? Well, it is. It's an ego beyond imagination of what level of arrogance that is. Come off your high horse. You know why? Because you don't even have a horse to sit on. As high as you think it is. It's all fiction. So how do we know God is the Borei? He's the creator. And creation was ex nihilo. And God is the manig. He guides existence from the first moment to the last moment to be able to achieve the objective, which is the goal of perfection? How do we know that whatever was, he made it. He caused it to be. Whatever is, it's him. Whatever will be, it's him. How do we know this? Same answer, Sinai. Well, these laws don't make sense. Why did tefillin have to be black? They have to be made of leather, compartments, shape. Why? It's like the person gets into an F-28, which I don't even know if it exists. I'm not sure how. Lockheed, you have to go there. And the person, it doesn't make sense. That component that goes into the computer, why does that be that computer? Why can't I take a toothpick and put it into that rather than component? They look at the man like there's something wrong with him. What are you talking about? What a toothpick. You can't pick up these components in the most sophisticated hardware store. They're designed specifically for the F-28 or whatever it is. So that the heart and the cartilage and the bone structure and white blood cells, red blood cells, the chemistry of the body, everything. Why does it have to be this way? Why does the heart have to have 4 chambers? Why not have 3 chambers? Why so many arteries? Those questions you don't ask. Why? Because they're such basic realities. It's a given. It's that way because that's the way it's supposed to be. But why is it supposed to be? Because if you don't believe in the Creator, you really don't know. It could have been 6, it could have been 20. But believe in a Creator because he chose, based on his infinite wisdom, for man to function and to have the value of representation of this spiritual, physical composite. He has to have 4 chambers in his heart because that somehow corresponds to something else, which represents 4. But who knows that? Only God knows that. But I don't have to know that. It's not important I should know that. That's why God created us. Of course, there's an understanding, but not understanding it is not a basis to say because it doesn't add up for us, therefore you reject it. So when we say we believe with absolute faith, with absolute belief, every one of these tenets goes back to Sinai. That's what we call Masorah, tradition. The 4 million people heard it, prophesied it, internalized it. They were touched to the core. They passed it on to their children. Accurate to the point of the nth degree of accuracy. They passed on to their children and the children's children until this very day. That is the basis. There's something interesting. The Rav Moshe Cordovero, who was a colleague of the Arizal, who's buried right next to the Arizal in the cemetery in Sfad, writes, based on the Zohar, that God is referred to as the disgraced king. Why is he disgraced? Could you imagine a person, the subject of the king, and he goes and he spits the king in the face. He has that level of arrogance. People would say, how arrogant could you be? Knowing he's the king, how do you spit him in the face? Don't you realize the consequences? Personally, knows no consequences. This king is a king. You can do whatever you want with him. You could defy him. You could abuse him. Doesn't respond. So what do you say? It's disgraceful. The king himself is allowing himself to be disgraced. Why? You don't know why. He must have something up his sleeve. He's waiting for the moment when this person is going to pay in spades for his level of insubordination, lack of reverence. not understanding who the king is. If we're saying there's nothing in existence that happens unless God wills that existence. So if a person wants to steal and he goes and plots the theft and plans it out, the intellect being employed in doing something which is contrary to God's will. When you go and you crack the safe and you do an act of stealing, which is contrary to God's will, that you take the money out of the safe, that you have to shoot a security guard and kill him, that you have the ability to pull that trigger. Every moment of that experience, which is at the most extreme level, contrary to the will of God, person do it. As I said, you can spit the king in the face and there's no recourse. There's no response, no reaction. So what does that say? Could there be a God? Can't be a God. How could there be a God? Person wants to commit adultery, God forbid. No problem. Not only that, an illegitimate child is conceived through the adultery. If God doesn't want it, why does he allow that conception take place? If the child is considered illegitimate and it's an innate defect in the child, in his soul, why? Doesn't that all prove that there is no God? Because who could be so foolish and tolerate such disgrace and insubordination? Evidently, there's no such thing. So the question turns into the answer. It doesn't make sense because therefore this must what it may be. No, there's an answer. You may not understand the answer, but there's an answer. There's a Mishnah where the Roman emperor says to the great rabbi of the Mishnah period, I'll prove to you that God is not the all-powerful one. He didn't create the sun, he didn't create the moon. Because we as sun worshipers, when we worship the sun, why doesn't God destroy the idol? He should destroy the sun, destroy the moon. That's what he says to the rabbi of the Mishnah, the Mishnah period. So the rabbi answers him, is because this person is foolish enough to serve idolatry and worship the sun or the moon or some other edifice of creation. So God, do you think he's going to destroy the world because of this person's misbehavior? The world is too precious. You worship a cow, okay? The Egyptian flock was decimated during the plague of the firstborn. Any animal that was a firstborn died in the plague of the firstborn. So we speak about the meticulousness of divine providence. Nothing goes unseen. Everything that happens to a person, it's only based on the person's behavior. That's what we see. A person who receives reward, although he seemingly should not, because he's so delinquent and so disrespectful, God should give him nothing. But you realize that's part of the smokescreen. For mankind to have proper choice, that the choice is valued, it has to be qualitative choice. Qualitative choice means you have a serious question, and despite that, you choose to say, I don't understand, which is really an ego test. That's an ego test when you don't understand. You should understand. No. What are you going to tell a person? No, it's impossible to understand. Unless you're at a certain level, then you sense it. It's not you understand. It's a sense of why that's the right way to do it. So if you speak to a person who just comes out of the jungle and you want to teach him Judaism, it's too complicated. Unless he believes you that initially we had clarity on the 100% level, and things have become confused in the past so many hundreds of years, that's acceptable. But to try to give explanations why, here it's this reason, there it's some other reason. Too many equations that are involved that you're able to process it. So again, where does it all go back to? It goes back to the beginning of creation. We only know beginning of creation because God said, well, why is God credible? God is credible because there was a Sinai. That gives the credibility to God on every level, including the Torah. That we say the Torah is the word of God is because all the Jews stood at the foot of Sinai when God spoke to every one of them and communicated all levels of understanding of those 10 commandments. We're going to stop here, stop the recording.